Welcome. Thank you all for joining us for our webinar today on the first National Primary Drinking Water Standards for 6 PFAS. I'm Rebecca Eicher, a project director with the American Association for the Advancement of Science's Center for Scientific Evidence in Public Issues, also known as the AAAS EPI Center. The AAAS EPI Center works to build trusted relationships between scientists and policymakers at all levels of government. And we try to make it easier for decision makers to access and use scientific information and for scientists to engage with policymakers at all scales. We work to bring clear, concise, and actionable scientific evidence to decision makers. Today's event is an opportunity to hear from a panel of experts who will discuss EPA's first national primary drinking water standards for 6 PFAS. The panelists will discuss the proposed regulations, the significance of setting the first national drinking water standards for PFAS, the scientific evidence that informed these draft standards, and the process for finalizing the rule. We will include time for questions from the audience, and we do encourage you to ask questions. We have a wonderful set of speakers today: Ryan Albert from the US EPA, as well as Jamie DeWitt from East Carolina University, Linda Birnbaum, scientist emeritus and former director of the National Institutes of Environmental Health Sciences and the National Toxicology Program, and Stephanie Schley of the Association of State Drinking Water Administrators. Before we move on to our wonderful panelists, a bit on logistics for today. So first, we encourage you to use the chat to introduce yourselves, share your ideas, resources, and information that you think is relevant for folks here today. Additionally, we have the Q&A box. That's where we'd like you to put your questions for our panelists. So go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A box and anything that you'd like to share in the chat, starting with introducing yourself with your name and organization in that chat box so that we can see who else is here in the virtual room today. We do hope to get to as many questions as possible, but we can't promise that we'll get to all of your questions. Please do reach out to us at the AAAS EPI Center with any follow-up questions or information that we can help with. For those of you attending this webinar live, you will receive a follow-up email with the link to the recording and a saved version of today's chat. Our speakers' bios are available on the AAAS EPI Center event webpage for this. So where you registered, you can find the full bios for our speakers today. We will make the slides available. And with that, I'll just say we're delighted to have our speakers and all of you join us today. And let's get started with the interesting part. So first, I will welcome Dr. Ryan Albert, Chief of the Risk Reduction Branch at the US EPA Office of Groundwater and Drinking Water. Ryan, thank you for joining us today. Take it away.
Great. Thank you very much, Rebecca. And I have to say, I'm enjoying seeing, I love the idea of having everybody type their names and affiliation in the chat box. It's really good to see who we're joined with today. Thank you all very much for joining today. And I always enjoy talking about our proposed PFAS National Drinking Water Regulation. As I go through it, just a couple quick notes, and you may hear me say many of these things throughout this presentation today. But first of all, we have proposed this National Primary Drinking Water Regulation in March. Our comment period will close on May 30th. Because we are in a public comment period, I'm somewhat limited in terms of what I can say in terms of answering questions. So you may hear me refer back to what's in the docket that we have where the information's gathered. Or you may also hear me note that it's a good question. We'd love to hear more about it, but we'd ask you to submit that to the docket. The other thing just to note, while of course I love hearing conversations today, any comment you want formally considered by EPA, please do submit to our docket, and I'll have that information here toward the end of this presentation today. So to the next slide. Okay, so for the vast majority of people here, I think looking at the audience members, I think most of us have some familiarity with PFAS. They're a category of manufactured chemicals. They've been around since roughly the 1940s, and they are incredibly useful and important in commerce. They're used in everything from waterproof clothing. If you go camping, they might be used on your tent, for instance, firefighting foam, so protection of human life, certain manufacturing processes, and other uses as well. And importantly, they break down very, very slowly, if at all, in the natural environment. There are a few PFAS that have been phased out of production and use in the United States. However, there are many other PFAS as well that we do have some health concerns about that are still in production. To the next slide. So over a long period of time, we are aware of many health effects that PFAS may have. And these are just summarizing a few of them. They need to lead to negative developmental effects, negative health effects on pregnant people and in developing babies. They weaken the body's ability to fight disease. So there's a lot of issues with immunotoxicity that we're aware of. There's an increased risk for some cancers and liver damage. And we've already identified two PFAS, PFOA and PFOS, as likely carcinogens. And they can elevate cholesterol levels, which increases the risk for strokes and heart attacks. And once again, these are just a few of the health endpoints or health effects that we're aware of. Drinking water is but one of several ways that people may be exposed to PFAS, and we found in communities where you have really elevated concentrations of PFAS can be one of the primary routes of exposure, but where we tend to have lower concentrations is just one of many different ways. There's also other sources in the home and outside in the human environment where people can be exposed. One of the things we found is PFAS tend to be found together in combinations. One of the things we found when we were researching this proposed regulation is we're looking for different indicators or different ground characteristics of what might contribute to PFAS being found. And what we found was the most likely indicator was if there was another PFAS there, we were more likely to find additional PFAS, which has both drawbacks and strengths, which I'll try to talk about here in just a minute. And one important note, EPA, with this proposal, we're acting now to protect people's drinking water and reduce exposure to PFAS over the long term so we can reduce people's health risks associated with PFAS exposure. To the next slide. So the National Primary Drinking Water Regulation, we're proposing MCLs for 6 PFAS in drinking water. For PFOA and PFOS as individual contaminants, and PFHXS, PFNA, PFBS, and GenX chemicals, also known as HFPODA, and we're regulating those as a mixture. And I'll talk about that here in just a little bit more. We're also proposing health-based non-enforceable maximum contaminant level goals. So these are the health goals for these 6 PFAS. MCLGs are basically the maximum level contaminant that we know is there in drinking water that are not known or anticipated to have any negative health effects, allowing for a margin of safety. To the next slide. So when we look at what those MCLGs and MCLs are for PFOA and PFOS, we have identified them, as I mentioned before, as likely carcinogens, and we have set the MCLG at 0. There's no known safe level of these two PFAS. We've proposed an MCL, which is the enforceable limit at 4.0 parts per trillion. And this is set at the level where we have, that's what we call the practical quantitation level, or the level we can reliably quantify the amount of these two PFAS in drinking water. For the other 4 PFAS, we're using a hazard index approach, which is an approach that's been used by many other EPA programs to consider the additivity and the cumulative risk from these different PFAS in both the MCLG and the MCLs at 1.0. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means in another slide here. Next slide. It's straight away. I forgot it was coming up right afterwards. So the short version is how we look at the hazard index is we will measure the contaminant of the concentration, of these 4 contaminants. And so, for instance, you would, if you measure GenX and you got a concentration of 8, you'd do 8 over 10. And if we had 0 for the other 3 contaminants, the hazard index value would be 0.8, and that would be below the MCL. So it's basically a summation of the ratio. When we calculate compliance, importantly, they're not utilities will not just be monitoring a single time. So they will be monitoring for between 2 and 4 times for their initial monitoring. And so they'll calculate what's called a running annual average. And that's basically just averaging the values from the previous year. So, or over the previous year. So if you have a 0.8 and a 0.6, then your running annual average will be a 0.7. So these slides will be available later, and the detailed instructions there are there to the right, but it's a fairly simple ratio when you see it written out. I think it kind of scared people when we first started talking about it a little bit. Couple other notes just from how we plan to implement this. We are developing an online calculator. Just for those folks who do not want to go through and do the mathematics themselves, they'll just be able to plug in their numbers and estimate their hazard index value so they can see where they are, or consumers can look at what their utilities have measured to calculate their hazard index as well. To the next slide. All right, so in addition to the MCLs, the enforceable limit, and the MCLGs, the health-based goals, there are several additional requirements that ensure that systems are meeting the limits, the National Primary Drinking Water Regulations, or the limits themselves. And these include requirements to monitor for PFAS, both to initially determine whether or not they need to treat for PFAS or to take other action to reduce PFAS levels, but also for those systems that do take actions, be it treatment or using different source water, whatever the case may be, that they continue to comply with the regulatory limits. There's also requirements to notify the public of levels of the monitored PFAS. And this was implied before, but explicitly, they must reduce the levels of PFAS in drinking water if they exceed the proposed MCLs or the proposed standards. Now, importantly, EPA is requesting comment on the proposed rule. This is a proposal, and EPA must finish going through the regulatory process before we finalize the regulations. We will take comment from members of the public on everything from occurrence information, health information, what information we consider as part of this regulation prior to finalizing the regulation. We will review each of those comments, consider them, and then finalize the regulation. Among other things, we're requesting comment on a preliminary determination to regulate 4 PFAS, PFHXS, PFNA, PFBS, and Gen X chemicals. The way the Safe Drinking Water Act is structured, we make a formal determination to regulate contaminants. We can do that concurrently with the regulation as we have done here. Nonetheless, we're taking comments specifically on these preliminary determinations. As noted before, this is a proposed regulation. It is not final regulation. No utilities, nobody's forced to take any action at this point in time until we finalize the regulation. And this is also important. This is perhaps the most important part of this presentation. We anticipate that if finalized as currently proposed, once fully implemented, the rule will prevent tens of thousands of serious PFAS attributable illnesses or deaths. And by serious illnesses, we're talking about things like cancers, heart attacks, strokes, so really debilitating, life-altering, and often fatal illnesses. To the next slide, please. So in terms of benefits, so under the Safe Drinking Water Act, EPA must consider quantifiable and non-quantifiable benefits. And so I mentioned 4 health endpoints or health effects earlier in this presentation. And here's a few others as well that we've considered as part of this regulatory proposal. And then when we identify what some of the potential health effects may be, where the economic sciences allow us to do so, we quantify those impacts. In the case of this regulation, mindful that we only quantify 4 different health effects at a 3% discount rate, we estimate an annual benefit of this rule of $1.23 billion. That's over 82 years. That's the average human lifespan we used because many of these illnesses take years to develop. So once again, $1.23 billion per year for 82 years. At a 7% discount rate, that is a $908 million annual benefit. Those quantified benefits include cardiovascular benefits, cancers, developmental benefits, and then we also considered co-removal benefits from removal of disinfection byproducts. There are several other benefits here, such as immune effects. I won't go through them all. That while there's a strong body of evidence that indicates these health effects, we don't have the economic sciences to quantify the benefits. So it's important that these quantified benefits, we recognize this is only a fraction of the total benefits delivered by this rule. To the next slide, please. So we're looking at cost. And so EPA also considers cost as we develop a regulation. And so we expect roughly 66,000 water systems to be subject to the rule. And we estimate roughly 5 to 10%, give or take. So roughly 3,400 to 6,300 systems are anticipated to exceed 1 or more MCL, which means they will have to take some sort of action, be it install treatment, use a different source water. There's several other options they could take as well. We've also considered, in addition to the capital costs, we've considered costs associated with administration, monitoring, and costs to primacy agencies or the states associated with rule implementation administration. Overall, the costs we analyzed at the 3% discount rate are $772 million. And this is once again amortized over the life, the projected benefit period, or the period we analyzed for the rule of 82 years. And at a 7% discount rate, that's $1.2 billion. Now, an important note, we do have an appendix in our economic analysis. So the economic analysis is a robust analysis where we consider both costs and benefits. One of the things we evaluated was, should PFAS be deemed a hazardous waste in the future, how much additional cost will we anticipate for public water systems or utilities? And we estimated costs would go up for about 30 to 61 million per year if water systems are required to treat it as hazardous waste. Very importantly, in order to move forward with a regulation, we must determine, the administrator of EPA must determine that the proposed regulation, the benefits justify the costs. In this case, the administrator have determined that those benefits do justify the cost of the regulation as proposed. So next slide. Couple notes, there are costs associated with removing PFAS from drinking water. Fortunately, there's a significant amount of federal funding that is available now and will be available over the coming years. We anticipate to be available over the coming years, made available under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, which provides $9 billion in grants specifically for disadvantaged communities and emerging contaminants. There's also an additional $12 billion of additional bill funds that are available as part of EPA's Drinking Water State Revolving Fund that also can be used for removing PFAS from drinking water as well. So there's significant federal funding currently available for utilities who do need to treat or otherwise take action to remove PFAS. Next slide. So the public comment period, as I mentioned before, we are in the public comment period, and the public docket can be accessed at www.regulations.gov. You just put in the docket ID number there. You can also just Google it or whatever your search engine of choice may be, and just put in EPA PFAS National Drinking Water Rule and regulations.gov, and that it will come up in most search engines. There are approximately 1,400 support documents in there, approximately 30 of which are documents that EPA has produced to support this regulation, including toxicity assessments, MCLG support documents, treatment technology evaluations, occurrence evaluations, and other sources of information as well. Importantly, the public comment period closes by May 30th, 2023. So please do submit if you have comments to submit to us. Whatever those may be, please submit them by that deadline. And if you have never submitted comments to a regulatory agency before, we recorded something a few months ago to help support folks. How do you work in regulations.gov? How do you submit comments? And so you can go to this particular website here, dockets and common EPA dockets, and it provides some additional information on how to actually provide those comments. To the next slide. Two other quick notes. So one of my colleagues did a much better job of giving a very similar presentation to this one on March 16th, 2023. We have a more detailed one that he gave on March 29th. Those are available on our website. You can just Google EPA PFAS drinking water proposed regulation or regulation, and you should be able to get right to our website. It's also worth noting that this Thursday we have a public hearing where we will give a presentation very similar to this one. today. And then most of the presentation is so we can hear verbal input from the public. Now, it's important to note that we will consider written and oral comments equally. So we're going to transcribe the oral comments, but if you submit written comments to us as well, it'll be considered no more, no less than the oral comments submitted. And, I note here, we invite members of the public to register and attend the hearing. There will be opportunity to make public comments to EPA. We did have a registration deadline of last Friday and have filled many slots, but we have an hour toward the end of the session where folks who missed the initial registration deadline may still present should they have an interest in presenting to the agency. Okay, the next slide. I think that's it. This is the actual website. If you want a direct link to it, I personally always just Google it and I go to the website fairly frequently. So I think that tells you what I find to be easier. But we look forward to those of you who submit comments. We look forward to reviewing those and considering them prior to finalizing the regulation. And thank you all for your time today.
Thanks, Ryan. There's one clarifying question that I think you could answer pretty quickly, which is which PFAS have been phased out of production and use?
Great. PFOA and PFAS are the two that we're regulating that have been phased out of production at this point in time. First starting, I want to say 2006, and it was a gradual phase out that went through about the middle of the last decade.
Great, thank you. I had a feeling you could do that one quickly. There are a lot of questions coming in, which is great to see. So keep them coming. And Ryan, thank you. We'll have Jamie DeWitt follow up next. Jamie is a professor in the Department of Pharmacology and Toxicology at the Brody School of Medicine at East Carolina University. So Jamie, welcome and take it away.
Thank you. And you can go ahead and go to my title slide. Before I get started in diving into the basis of some of these proposed MCLs, I just wanted to share that I was a member of the EPA PFAS Science Advisory Board, so I was part of some of the evaluation of the science behind these decisions. I also serve and have served as a plaintiff's expert witness in cases involving PFAS. I do receive state and federal funding to study the immunotoxic effects of PFAS, and I am a donator to AAAS through my annual charitable donations, although hopefully that's not influencing anything here today. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. So on this next slide is just a quick summary of some of the health points that were selected by the US EPA for consideration of what's known as a reference dose. So many of you are probably familiar with the term reference dose. Some of you might be thinking that it has something to do with an RDA and vitamins that you take in, but no, a reference dose is the concentration of a chemical that is not anticipated to be associated with adverse health effects if somebody is exposed across a lifetime. So these are chronic reference doses, and these are the values that were used to calculate or derive those maximum contaminant levels that are being proposed. And I wanted to point out a few things on this slide that helps you get your mind around some of the science that the US EPA considered behind this decision. So the first thing that I'd like you to take away is that all of the reference doses that were considered here from the various studies were derived from human studies. So if you look across the various endpoints, we have immune endpoints, developmental endpoints, cardiovascular disease endpoints as indicated by high cholesterol, and liver endpoints, which are indicated down there on the bottom by hepatic. All of these studies were epidemiological studies that considered humans exposed to PFOA through their drinking water, through their workplaces, or from where they live in general. So these are human-based reference doses. Another thing that I want you to take away from this is the candidate RFD column. I want you to notice how low these concentrations are for PFOA. These are extremely low concentrations that were measured in the bodies of the people who were study participants in these various studies. The boxes highlighted in blue represent the 3 endpoints that were considered for the reference dose, or the points of departure that were used to create the reference dose. And that is for immune, developmental, and cardiovascular disease risks. These all occur at about the same low concentration. So in other words, these 3 health effects occur in exposed people at very low concentrations, which is why they were identified as the reference doses for derivation of the maximum contaminant levels proposed for PFOA. If we go to the next slide, you can see that very similar endpoints were considered for PFOS. And if you look at the different references, you can see that many of the references are the same between PFOA and PFOS. So some of the same studies that measured these health effects in people who had PFOA in their blood, all these people also had PFOS in their blood. So this demonstrates that PFOS and PFOA occur in similar areas. So people are similarly exposed. The same types of health effects were associated with levels of PFOS in people's blood. And you will see that these also occur at very low levels of internal concentration. So these are low concentrations of PFOS that are also associated with health effects. For PFOS, only 2 of these health endpoints were selected to derive the reference dose. That would be the developmental effects and the cardiovascular disease risk. And the reference dose is slightly higher than the reference dose for PFOA. But again, these are human studies from humans exposed to PFOS in the environment or in their workplaces, and they occur at very low concentrations. So these are the non-cancer endpoints that were used to derive the reference doses, which are behind those values that Brian just discussed. So if you go to the next slide, we can also see that the US EPA upgraded the cancer risk categories for both PFOA and PFOS. In previous documents, the cancer risk category was suggestive of cancer. They are now both considered to be likely human carcinogens. And if you look at the information there for PFOA, this is based on evidence of kidney and testicular cancer links in human populations, and then Leydig cell tumors, which is a type of testicular tumor, pancreatic acinar cell tumors, and hepatocellular adenomas or liver tumors in rats. So both human data and experimental animal data are supporting this cancer designation for PFOA. And if you look at the information for PFOS, you can see that this information is largely based on evidence from experimental rodent models, but there is some mixed evidence associating cancer risk with PFOS in human populations. So both PFOA and PFOS are likely human carcinogens according to the evidence evaluation by the US EPA for this maximum contaminant level goal. Next slide, please. I also wanted to mention some of the health effects that were identified for the 4 PFAS in the hazard index proposed rule. That would be GenX, PFNA, PFBS, and PFHXS. All of the reference doses for these 4 compounds come from experimental animal studies, and we could have a long conversation about what types of data are available for these compounds. Just remember, they haven't been studied quite as long as PFOA and PFOS. So the database behind these chemicals is not quite as extensive as for PFOA and PFOS with respect to some of the human studies that have been done. For GenX, the reference dose was informed by experimental animal models demonstrating effects on the liver. For PFNA, experimental animal models highlight that developmental endpoints are a cause for concern. And for PFBS and PFHXS, the thyroid gland is considered to be cause for concern. So here we have 4 different chemicals, 3 different health endpoints. And remember, the hazard index approach suggests that these chemicals work together to increase the health effects of one another. So if you have GenX and PFNA, the health effects or the developmental effects and the liver effects can be greater in living organisms exposed to both of these compounds together. Next slide, please. And this will be my last slide. So Ryan already pointed this out, but I wanted to also point out that reducing levels of these PFAS will hopefully reduce concentrations of other PFAS that co-occur with them in drinking water sources. So that is the goal, that if we can help to remediate or filter out or somehow destroy these 6 different PFAS, then the technologies that we use to remediate these PFAS will also extend to other PFAS that people are getting exposed to in their drinking water. And with that, I thank you for listening. I thank AAAS for inviting me here, and I look forward to an interactive discussion with everyone.
Great. Thank you, Jamie. Really helpful to share the related evidence of human health effects for the draft rule. So next, I'd like to welcome Linda Birnbaum to the conversation. Linda is the former director of the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, of the National Institutes of Health, and the National Toxicology Program. After her retirement, she was granted Scientist Emeritus status, still maintains a laboratory, and is a scholar in residence at the Nicholas School of the Environment at Duke University. So I'm not sure what you've retired from, but we're glad to have you.
Well, Rebecca, thank you very much. And thank you all for being here. I want to say it's really a pleasure to have the opportunity to talk somewhat about the the impacts of what this rule may have on human health effects. I think we all realize that prevention is so much better than treatment and cure. And if we can reduce our exposure to PFOA and PFOS and the 4 other PFAS, the 4 out of another 12,000 that exist, I think it'll be better for all of us. What I wanted to point out, and I think Jamie did a beautiful job of going through and mentioning the human data, is that the effects that have been observed in people have also been observed in animals, wildlife, as well as experimental animals. And I think that it's important to realize that PFOA, PFOS, and the other 4 really cause this plethora of effects. And they affect, when you start looking, you see effects in almost every organ and tissue that's been looked at. You see effects in essentially every, certainly vertebrate species that has been looked at. There's extensive data that exists from fish and birds and all kinds of mammals, including non-human primates, as well as people. We see effects in both males and females from these compounds, and we see effects at different life stages. I often focus on the early life exposure as that is so explicitly sensitive, but we see effects later on as well. I think that it's really very important to realize that nature is inherently quite conservative. And when things happen in multiple species and both sexes across the lifespan, it is highly likely that these effects occur in at least some of the population as well. I think it's also important to point out that EPA's analysis is not out there all by itself. The Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry in 2021 released its concerns for 4 of these chemicals, PFOS, PFOA, PFNA, and PFHXS. The same chemicals were focused on by the European Food Safety Authority, which in 2020 released risk assessments, for example, on those 4 chemicals. And the National Academy of Sciences last September held a consensus series of meetings and came out with a report actually recommending clinical guidance related to exposures to especially PFOA and PFOS, but they actually looked at the 6 here. They did not include Gen X, I should say, but they looked at the 5 here and they looked at 2 other PFAS as well. And again, they had concluded that there was clear evidence of hepatic effects, clear evidence of immune effects, clear evidence of impacts on infant and fetal growth, and really strong evidence for an increased risk of kidney cancer in adults. They also believed that there was suggestive evidence of an association with other kinds of cancer, the testicular cancer and breast cancer as well, that there was increased risk of the pregnancy-associated hypertension, including preeclampsia, which we know is actually increasing in incidence in the population of great concern. The problems with thyroid disease, which are increasing, and then the autoimmune response with the increased risk of ulcerative colitis. They said that some of the other effects, there's less data for, but the data is building. And I think that's another thing to point out, that with these chemicals, we are getting so much new data, literally on, if not a daily basis, certainly a weekly basis where things are being reported. But the National Academies actually recommended that that people who were concerned or living in areas where they were likely to have more exposure from drinking water. And I want to make the point here that while we're talking about regulations of 6 PFAS in municipal drinking water systems, we all, I think, are aware of the fact that we are all exposed everywhere, all the time, all at once, to a whole bunch of PFAS from the food that we eat, the consumer products that we use, the cosmetics we put on our bodies, the household products that we use. I mean, just a plethora of different exposures. Also, for example, heavily used in electronics as lubricants and so on. So these are very useful chemicals, but we're all exposed all the time. And I think probably everyone on this webinar is aware of one of the big problems with them is their tremendous persistence. They are all environmentally persistent. The carbon-fluorine bond basically does not occur in nature, so nature hasn't figured out a way to deal with it. It's difficult to break. So I just think something we have to really think seriously about. I should go back to the clinical guidance where the National Academies recommended that if people had levels higher than 2 parts per billion in their serum, that they should be followed up for some biomedical screening. And if they had more than 20, they should definitely be followed up as well. Now, you may ask, how can you roughly estimate what the body level might be if you know what your drinking level is? And Gloria Post of New Jersey DEP a number of years ago did a beautiful study where she showed that roughly if you took the PFOA or PFOS drinking water concentration and multiplied by approximately a factor of 100 to 200, it would put you in the neighborhood of what your serum levels might be. So I think that was helpful. One question that I know has already come up and people are a little, I think, confused about the hazard index. And I think it's important to understand that EPA has used this approach before. I don't think OW has used it before, but the Office of Air used it all the time for air toxics, and Superfund uses it. And the hazard index is the sum of the hazard quotients. And I think the important thing here is that, you're looking at the concentration divided by a reference dose, or if we were dealing with air, a reference concentration, which is a concentration at where you do not expect adverse effects. So the idea that this is a unique or a new approach is really not true. EPA has used this before. So I think that actually gets across many of the points I thought were important to get across, and I really look forward to having the opportunity to answer some questions. Thank you.
Thank you. And I should have started by saying Dr. Linda Birnbaum, so apologies for that. Really helpful to hear that additional context and helpful information. Last from our panelists, we have Stephanie Schley, Senior Water Policy Advisor for the Association of State Drinking Water Administrators, to share a bit about the implications for states and help us understand more of where the state perspective is coming from. So welcome, Stephanie. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all so much for inviting me today. I'm really excited to chat with everyone. I loved seeing all of the names and organizations go in the chat. I saw a ton of ASDWA members, so I'm very excited for that. As Rebecca said, I'm Stephanie Schley. I'm with ASDWA as the Senior Water Policy Advisor. And ASDWA is a nonprofit, nonpartisan, nonprofit NGO in the DC area, and we represent the state drinking water administrators from all 50 states, the 5 territories, DC, and the Navajo Nation. And kind of similar to some other plugs we've had, we are in the middle of the comment process right now. We're working with our members to develop our own comments. So anything I'm talking about today is kind of just what we're taking away from conversations and not necessarily reflective of any comments that ASDWA might make at the end of this process. Next slide. Awesome. So here is just an overview of states that have guidelines, advisories, or regulations in place or development. So the purple are all states that have some sort of guideline, action level, advisory, something that's non-enforceable. The blue are all states or territories that have an MCL in place or are in development of, or in the process of developing an MCL. Next slide. So I'm not going to dig into this, reading line by line. What I really want you all to take away from this is getting a sense of how different we have been regulating PFAS and drinking water throughout the country. Of note, PFOA and PFOS is obviously the most highly regulated of PFAS, but if you look here, none of the states that are currently regulating PFOA and PFOS are doing so at the levels the EPA has proposed at 4 parts per trillion. Additionally, we have some states that are doing them individually, others as sums. And another part that I like to point out, one of my members recently said, and I really liked it, calling them the orphan PFAS, which is states that are regulating PFAS that EPA has chosen at this time not to. So for example, Massachusetts, they have PFHPA and PFDA. Those two are not included in EPA's regulation, but obviously Massachusetts here does not have Gen X or PFBS in theirs. And so as we look to implement this rule, states will end up having to be at least as stringent as EPA's rule. So they're all going to have to figure out, how does this new rule interact with their current rule? And that's a lot of discussions that these states are currently working through right now. Next slide. So here's what I mostly want to talk about today, which is the implementation challenges that we're kind of looking at and discussing with the states for this rule. And I split them up into really 5 big categories. Staff workload and technical assistance is what I'll spend the most time on today. So I just want to touch base here a little bit first on primacy packages. Primacy packages are what states have to put together and submit to EPA within 2 years of a rule. So any rule that goes into place, they submit these packages to EPA, and it's basically a bunch of documentation to show how they're going to be able to implement this rule sufficiently so that they get primary enforcement of those rules within their states. And this can take quite a bit of time. Some of our states have very extensive public comment periods that they have to go through for any rulemaking that they do. And they can get extensions, but it's still just a tight timeline for staff working to get this done. Risk communications, I don't think I am shocking anyone on this call when I say that risk communications for PFAS is difficult. When we're looking at this, communicating the health risks is really difficult. I kind of lump this in with the health advisories versus the MPDWRs because we're looking at a lot of different values. So with the regulation, we have the max contaminant level at 4 for PFOA and PFOS. The MCLGs are at 0. And then we have these health advisories that came out last year that have numbers significantly lower, in fact, below detection. And so trying to explain that to the public as to why your MCL is at 4 because of implementation and capability, but EPA says that the level at which there are no anticipated negative health impacts is so much lower. It's a difficult piece to communicate. And I did really appreciate Linda's comment because it was one of mine as far as talking about all the different exposures. We spend a lot of time discussing drinking water, but it's not the only place that we're being exposed to PFAS. And so how do you navigate that conversation? And so yeah, I think overall that's kind of a lot of the difficulties in communicating that, and that's something that we've been working with our states and developing materials and helping, but I think it's going to be one of the largest challenges we see as we move forward. Next slide, please. Okay, so staff workloads. This is one that you're going to hear about a lot probably as we go through trying to figure out on the state side. So this is not necessarily specific to PFAS. States are struggling to fill existing vacancies. A lot of them are. Some are doing okay, but others have really struggling, particularly with engineering positions. They're having trouble competing with the private sector and the salaries there. They're also concerns with states that aren't currently regulating PFAS. They may not necessarily have sufficient staff dedicated to PFAS at this time. And it can be really difficult for some states to obtain new FTEs to implement a rule like this. Some states actually have to go to their legislature to ask for additional FTEs to be added to their agencies. So it's not necessarily something that for every state is going to be extremely easy to do as soon as this rulemaking goes into place. Unsurprising again, there's a lot of competing priorities for staff time. So if we're already, struggling to keep staff, keep positions full, we're also looking at the same time of implementing the lead and copper rule revisions, which has all of us doing these inventories across the country. We're looking at doing the lead and copper rule improvements later this year. Cybersecurity has become a big topic for states and systems to look at. And then, of course, we're also dealing with the bipartisan infrastructure law, which gave us an immense amount of money, needed money to go through the state revolving funds. But that's made a large increase in the workload for states. And with Bill in mind, and I'm just going to put a tiny pin in this because it's become kind of a soapbox of mine, but there's been a lot of concerns with funding cuts from earmarks. So every year, the states get a certain amount from Congress through the state revolving funds for projects for improving drinking water infrastructure. And some of those can come out as set-asides that states often use to fund FTEs within their programs that are doing drinking water regulations. In the last couple of years, we've seen some significant funding cuts there, and there are concerns that if that keeps up long-term, that we're going to have struggles maintaining the current staff that we have, let alone getting more staff. So it's something that they're having to look at a lot of moving parts long-term for implementing all of the Safe Drinking Water Act rules, not just PFAS. Next. Awesome. So the last one I want to touch on is probably the thing we're talking about the most in my state meetings, which is all the technical assistance that's going to be involved with implementing this rule. So when we're looking at this, particularly small systems is where we've been discussing a lot. Small systems tend to have a lot of TMF issues. So technical, managerial, financial capacity is not always where we might like it to be. And so states are anticipating they're going to be answering a lot of operator questions across the board, small, medium, large systems. But with smalls, they're anticipating that they're going to have to help them find consultants, maybe help them find funding through the SRFs or bill, have to provide assistance during the piloting process as those systems try to determine what treatment they will put in place. And then alongside that is they're going to be developing new training modules. So a lot of our states do a lot of workshops and in-person one-on-one trainings with systems. It's a fantastic way that they are able to interact with their communities and make sure that they have compliance, but that's a lot of staff time. If they have to develop these workshops, they travel in person. It's a lot of time that they devote, and there's some discussion of expectation that this might, it's going to be a fairly complicated rule to get going because of like the levels of that we're dealing with the 4 parts, and also the monitoring being at levels that the 1.3 parts per trillion and the 1/3 MCL for reduced monitoring. There's some discussion there, how easy is that going to be to explain to systems and also to actually implement? Are systems going to be tripped out of reduced monitoring far more often than they are maybe with rules that have higher MCLs? Or similar kind of with treatment is, how often are we going to see systems kind of bounce in and out of that 4 parts, particularly 4 parts because they are so near detection. And then the outreach to systems continuing out of compliance. Some of our states we've heard that already have regs in place on their own have had a lot of issues with, or had some issues with systems that choose to stay out of compliance due to the cost of treatment. This is from what we've been hearing is mostly very small systems, but that it's just too much of a lift for them because a lot of that cost has to come out of the ratepayer base. It is sometimes in these scenarios, they've just chosen to continually be out of compliance. And so that's a lot of time that the states have to spend as well, going back and forth and trying to work with them to find ways to get them into compliance. Next slide. So there's my email. Thank you all so much. I hope I taught you a little bit here. I really appreciate being invited to give our perspective from the states, and I look forward to the discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you, Stephanie. And I will welcome everybody to turn on their cameras as we get started. As you can see, well, first of all, there's lots of applause coming in, so thank you all, as well as a fair number of questions coming in already. So again, we won't be able to take any verbal questions from attendees. So if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A and we will try to get to some of those questions. I think I'll start with a relatively broad question, but around resources. So what resources are available from EPA or other organizations to support communities, water utilities, those folks working to meet these rule requirements? And are there resources that might be helpful after the rule is finalized? And if it's one of those, woo, there's a lot, we can collate this and share it after the webinar. So we're happy to do that. But in general, if you have some ideas, that would be helpful.
Great. Thank you, Rebecca. I'll jump in, and Stephanie may have some additional things she'd like to weigh in on as well. But yes, there will be resources available to help support utilities and states as well. And the resources I referenced, which are mostly a blessing, I think, for our state partners, are the bipartisan infrastructure law funds, roughly $9 billion in grant funding that are designed to target disadvantaged communities and emerging contaminants. So both of the, looking PFAS are an emerging contaminant. We also have the resources directly for disadvantaged communities as well. Additionally, one of the things to go, so that's thinking about out of the rule context, just generally what resources are available to being provided by EPA right now. Additionally, in the rule itself, we are asking for comment on what additional resources, technical resources, will be helpful for utilities and others implementing the regulation. And so we will consider whatever comments are submitted to us and decide what additional technical assistance we can provide in the future.
Yeah, and I'll just jump into, as was work to put together some state-specific communication materials along with a template for water systems looking to communicate doing some public notice. When the process that was released the same day of EPA's proposal, so we weren't aware of the hazard index when we put it together. So we're planning on updating it. So if you're from a state agency, I would say, because I saw a lot of you, we are in the process of updating that. But I think I saw also, or maybe I didn't, ITRC has some really Interstate Technology Research Council, I think. They have some really good resources in general, not just drinking water, but really good PFAS resources that I always really try and point people to. And then some of our states that are already regulating PFAS, also, if you go to their websites, they have some really good information on there too that can be used.
Great, thank you. Thinking a little bit about treatment and some of what you said, Jamie, around treating for the 6 PFAS, and hopefully that will treat for additional PFAS. I know none of you are necessarily treatment experts, but there are a couple questions kind of similar and related coming in. So the first would be, in general, can you talk just maybe a little bit about what some of the treatment methods may be for these 6 PFAS? And then what are these concerns if these treatment methods may be directed for long chain PFAS? Will they also work for short chain, and kind of just a little bit about that? I know we didn't talk too much about treatment methods and it's not anyone's particular area, but I know you all know a lot. So if someone wants to start, I welcome that.
I feel like that's Stephanie's area or Linda's area.
I'll take a little stab at it, although this is my generalist hat on. I think that as far as it comes to, for example, getting rid of PFAS from drinking water, there are several kinds of filtration which can work quite effectively. There's granular activated charcoal filtration, which does a good job with PFOA and PFOS. With some of the shorter chains, it does a good job with PFNA. With some of the shorter chains and with things like Gen X, which is an ether, it's not quite as good, but it's better than nothing. Reverse osmosis is much more effective, but also much more difficult and more expensive to develop and maintain. I think it works kind of better if you have it under your sink than it does at the plant, although it is also trying to be used at the plant. The problem we always have with filtration is, what do you do with the contaminated filters? Obviously, upkeep is a big issue because you've got to be sure to keep changing out your filters. And then what do you do with them? And if they're declared hazardous waste, which some of us think might be appropriate, they're going to have to probably go to a hazardous landfill. I've actually been pushing, I'd love to see some research being done on recovery of PFAS from the filters, so that where there's essential uses, what's already been made could be reused rather than having to create new carbon fluorine bonds. Other kinds of remediation, there really are not. Incineration has not been shown on any kind of real time or real place scale to work terribly well. There are several ways that you can break the carbon fluorine bonds. There are some chemical ways, but most of this is desktop experimental work that has not been shown to work out in the field at all yet. The other thing that's being done is deep well injection. And again, maybe not the best thing that we want to do going forward.
I'll just add to that. Linda did a really good job. One of the other ones I think kind of touched on membrane ion exchange is another one
Right,
that's one of the best available technologies that the rule says. But I wanted to note that I kind of said it as an aside, but pilot testing, when a system goes to treat for PFAS, they're doing what we call pilot testing, which is small scale, looking at here's our water quality, here's our options, and they work with their consultants or with their internal folks to really figure out what's going to work best for the source waters that they have and the PFAS that they are trying to address. So there's a lot that goes in. It's not just kind of like a system says, I feel like doing granule activated carbon, or I feel like doing ion exchange. They do a lot of that work, but there definitely is some differences in how effective they can be with the different PFAS. And I think getting to Jamie's point is, once we get beyond those 6, it gets even more kind of wild west as far as what's going to work with what. But regardless, I agree with Jamie where it's if you're putting something in place, if there's other PFAS, you're gonna be capturing something. It's just kind of how much into what effectiveness.
Rebecca, I'll just jump in and first of all thank my co-panelists here for I think very solid answers. So in terms of the rule context, just reference folks, we do actually talk about co-removal. And so I would reference folks to part 11 of the Federal Register notice, where we talk about treatment technologies. And we also consider co-removal as part of the economic co-benefits. And so we look at these other unregulated PFAS because in our proposal, we identify while we're regulating 6, one of the nice benefits of this proposed rule is we will reduce the other PFAS as well. Now, taking off the rule hat, this is information that came out after the rule was published, is not in our docket. So I'm not speaking specifically to the regulation, but I am speaking to the question of how do we know that these technologies remove PFAS. There's a recently published paper. It's officially, I think, published in July, but I want to say it came out about midway through last month. Jonathan Burkhart et al., and it is in the Journal of Water Process Engineering. Some of my ORD colleagues and one of my OW colleagues published that looked at really the removal potential of roughly 450 PFAS and talked about the relative removal potential of these different PFAS. It's a really interesting paper, and if you're interested in such things, and since we are here with AAAS, it might be a good thing for those who are interested to go take a look.
I was going to say, can you jump, because I wasn't aware of that paper and I would love to read it.
Great. It looks like one of my Region 5 colleagues just dropped it into the chat here. So thank you, Ken, for doing so.
Wonderful. And then I think, Ryan, if you have any answers around the question of, we know that the bipartisan IIJA money is becoming available for the beginning of the treatment. Are any other resources being discussed about the ongoing cost of treatment, or thoughts about how, maybe Stephanie from the state's perspective, any thoughts on how to support this or the resources that may be available long-term for treatment?
I can go first. I guess for definitely, as Ryan said, so I'm also the lead on infrastructure and financing for ASWA, so I have a lot of thoughts. But Ryan's correct. So there's a whole pot of money under the infrastructure law for specifically earmarked for emerging contaminants with a focus on PFAS. We also have, as I said, the state revolving funds happen every year. And those can be also used to address PFAS. The issue, getting on, again, my soapbox a little bit, the issue that we see or I guess personally, that I get concerned about when we're talking about PFAS is all of our federal funding, I believe for the big pots cannot be used for operation and maintenance or for staff. And so when, there can be, when you're renewing your carbon or getting new membranes, that can add up over time. And on top of it, if you need either if you need new staff or anything to implement the process you have in place, it can be a little bit difficult too. But for the actual construction of the plants and treatment modules, there's a lot of federal funding out there.
Great, thank you.
And I don't have anything more than what Stephanie said. I think she answered the question quite nicely.
Thank you. Wonderful. I'm going to shift gears a little bit and try to help people think a little bit and talk about the MCLs, the 4 parts per trillion, the MCLGs, the health advisories. And the question that I think a lot of people wonder is, if these numbers are not the same, is 4 parts per trillion protective of human health and the environment? I don't know who wants to start. Linda, Jamie.
I'll go ahead and just start. I'm a pragmatist, so I would say that there's no risk associated for PPT, but it's a heck of a lot better than, for example, the previous lifetime health advisory, which many states were using for guidance, and some for some kinds of many water systems were adjusting to, of 70 parts per trillion. So I think it's a big improvement. I would hope, and I think maybe Ryan could answer this part of the of my comment or the question, as technology improves, since the 4 PPT is largely based on technological understanding and some economics, will the MCL drop?
Linda, I get to use my favorite answer first with you, and that is a interesting question, and please do submit it to the docket so we can consider it as we consider finalizing the regulation.
And I'll just jump in to add that I've said publicly many times that the only safe exposure concentration of any PFAS to any person is 0 parts per trillion. So that is the only level that we can guarantee that nobody anywhere will experience any adverse health outcomes or increased health risks. I think 4 parts per trillion is, as Dr. Birnbaum said, is better than 70 parts per trillion, but there is no guarantee that this level will not produce any adverse health risks in a single person. So it is still possible. I don't know if it's probable, but it's possible that somebody somewhere could experience elevated health risks at this level. But we, based on the data right now, do not anticipate that anybody will experience those health risks at this level.
And I'll just add, I'm not a toxicologist at all, so I'm going to leave that to Jamie and Linda. But I will just say, for us, we talk a lot about the difficulties that will be with implementing this rule. But the point that we're all trying to get to is something that is implementable and effective with the current technologies and resources we have available to us right now. So the states, as we're looking at this, are very committed to working with EPA and helping their systems out to do the best that we can with what we're given to protect public health. So I think that's, at the end of the day, I guess kind of going Linda pragmatist is, in my head, what is feasible? What can we actually do on the ground to protect the public health to the best of our ability?
Yep, much appreciated for that extra context. Ryan, I think this is a question you might be able to help us with, and it wouldn't need to be submitted, which is, can you share a little bit about the timeline? So, say the rule is final. How long do the public water supply systems have to reduce levels if they exceed the MCL? Can you just talk a little bit about what that timeline looks like for, actually, you could start from May 30th, public comments close, and if you could walk us through what the timeline looks like for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great question. So the public comment period will close on May 30th. So starting on June 1st, we get very busy trying to finalize the regulation. Our goal is to finalize that regulation on by the end of this calendar year. I will note this is an ambitious goal, but we will do everything in our power to do so, to try to finalize at that point. Now, once we finalize the regulation as proposed, mindful things could change based upon the public comments we get, right? But as proposed, there would be a 3-year window where utilities can collect their monitoring data. Depending on the size of the system, it's going to be, and the source water of the system, it'll either be two samples they collect or 4 samples they collect. One of the things we put in here, we are very mindful of resources, and we want to use the public's resources, utilities resources, where we get the most bang for the buck. So we put in a proposal to try to use existing data. So for those states that are already collecting data, and then for those systems that are collecting data on a different EPA program, the Unregulated Contaminant Monitoring Program, we propose that they will be able to use those data to meet their initial monitoring requirements, which should reduce the monitoring burden for many systems. And basically most, if not all, systems that serve greater than 3,300 people. So during that period, based on those data, systems will find out if they have to treat or not treat, and then they would need to install treatment or take a different action to reduce the PFAS concentrations 3 years after rule proposal. Now, it is important to note that CIDWA has several provisions whereby we can extend it beyond 3 years on in some cases, a blanket way, but mostly it's case-by-case basis. And so, for example, one of those ways we can extend it is for small systems if they have some capacity issues. So while the general deadline is in 3 years, there will be some circumstances where the primacy agencies may elect to extend it beyond those 3 years. And we're taking comments on all aspects of the proposal as it's currently constructed, and particularly with timelines as well.
Great. So hopefully that clarifies for folks. I think another space where we've been hearing some questions, and each of you, well, not all of you, but there's been a little bit of talk around that hazard index, and that it's a relatively new idea for folks in the water space. So I was wondering if people on the panel could share a little bit about the scientific basis for the hazard index and the mixture of 4. And Linda, I know you had shared a bit about how other parts of EPA have used this hazard index. So could you just expand a little bit on that for all of us to think more about comfort level and understanding around the hazard index?
Well, the hazard index is just a ratio of the exposure to a level where you would think there'd be no problem. Because the PFAS cause similar, if not in many cases, the same kind of health effects in multiple tissues. Sometimes we have data from multiple species. Adding those ratios up is a reasonable approach of what you can do. My one concern going forward is that it took a lot of data in order to develop the RFD for those 4 PFAS. EPA is now, the Office of Water has, or the Office of Research and Development, EPA, has developed RFDs for a couple of other PFAS. And I guess what I'm wondering is, will, again, Ryan, you're probably going to say, put this in the comments, and I would urge other people that this resonates with to put that in the comments as well. The question is, well, like they've just done an RFD for PFDA, and they're doing ones for PFBA and PFHXA. And will that now be added? So the hazard index with an MCLG and an MCL of 1, will those be added into the sum of the hazard quotients as well?
Right. So I will piggyback on the first part of Linda's answer, just to direct folks to resources if they want to read more about it. So in the Federal Register notice, so this is really kind of the summary of all of the technical information in addition to the regulatory proposal itself. I'd recommend interested readers go to parts 4 and 5, where we talk about the MCLG development, including the hazard index and the science behind it. For those who want to dive a bit deeper, if you go into regulations.gov, I'd recommend 2 separate documents. One is the document that summarizes the science behind the MCLG development itself. So it talks about how we develop the health-based water concentrations and the hazard index. And if you want a little bit more of the science behind it, then you can go to what we call the mixtures document. This is one of the documents we sent to the Science Advisory Board that Jamie served on to seek their feedback. And so this talked about several different ways that EPA could consider mixtures as part of a regulatory proposal. So that document's in the docket as well. And Linda, you have already answered the second part of the question for me, but just to reinforce, that's a very interesting point, and we very much look forward to seeing that in the docket should you choose to submit it.
And then one last question for you, Ryan. Well, no, not one last question. One last question on this thread. You had mentioned the hazard index calculator. Do you have any update on when that might be available or the timing of that?
Yeah, thank you. So this is something we're developing outside the actual official regulatory process. So this is more of an implementation or support tool. So I would anticipate we will have it by rule finalization, if not sooner. I don't want to give a firm commitment to it because obviously we're going to have to prioritize development of the rule, and the same people who are working on this are also going to be working on the rule. So it is something we anticipate having around the time we finalize the regulation or before. And once again, it's a web-based tool. I think most people, when they see it, you're just going to plug in the numbers and it'll spit out a hazard index for you, but it kind of runs through the process a little bit. It's a compliance assistance tool, but also an educational tool as well.
Great. And then I saw there is like one little question about this where has the hazard index been used for any other class as large as PFAS? So Linda, I don't know if you might know the answer to that.
I'm trying to think of other classes that are as large as PFAS. In the approach that the agency has used very successfully for over 20 years has been the toxic equivalency approach, which is used for the dioxins and the dioxin-like PCBs. And there are like 208 dioxins and 209 PCBs, only about 27 or 29 of which are dioxin-like. But that is basically a relative potency ranking scheme where you sum up the concentration times the relative potency factor, and that gives you the total equivalency of the toxicity as if it were TCDD. So it is an additive approach. There's quite a number of papers that have been shown that you can, looking at about 16 PFAS, there's some data showing, especially coming out of the Netherlands, that you can basically add up the toxicity of those 16 PFAS. So I think adding up the risk and the exposure and the risk or the hazard evaluation is a similar kind of approach. But I don't know how extensively it's been used in, and how it's been done specifically in OA or Superfund.
Yeah, appreciate that because I know no one, we don't have those folks on the call, so difficult to answer, but appreciate the context. So this could be a long answer or it could be a short one, but I think it would be interesting to hear from all of you. So I want to give it now so that we have a little bit of time to think about it. But, we know that drinking water is one source of PFAS, and we know that there are a lot of other sources. So I think folks are really interested to hear what other sources of PFAS are being regulated or being considered to be regulated. So our exposure, right? And what really are other agencies or organizations doing to address these sources and exposure pathways? And how do we as individuals or the collective start to address these different exposure pathways? I think it would be interesting to hear from all of you if you feel comfortable, but you can also pass if you don't.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Stephanie.
Oh, I was just gonna say, so kind of two things, and I'll love to hear Jamie or Linda may correct me a bit on this. This is getting on my own personal soapbox a little bit, not necessarily ASWA, but ASWA as a whole has pushed very strongly for doing a holistic approach when it comes to addressing PFAS. EPA is really spearheading the work on PFAS. They have the roadmap. It started in the previous administration as the action plan. For me, TSCA, the Toxic Substance Control Act, is something that the Lautenberg Act recently gave EPA a lot more authorities to be working on both existing and new chemicals. I think, that's one where getting EPA more staff, more resources, I think there's a lot that can be done on that side of the house. But I also think FDA is a really big one to kind of get into the game. This is where Linda and Jamie may know better than me. I don't believe that the other federal agencies have done anything regulatorily speaking for PFAS. But when it comes to when we're talking makeup and food and a lot of these other sources, that's going to be FDA. And then when it comes to clothing, all that, I don't even know. I don't even know when we get into that who would be doing it. But I think my takeaway for me is that where we're addressing this at the tap is the absolute last place we should be dealing with it. Like, this is our last line of defense type of thing when it comes to it's already reached drinking water. I think that there needs to be a lot more done before it, thank you for the claps, before it gets to that point, because we're really putting there's federal funding and things, but we're putting a lot of that responsibility on the people at the end of the tap to pay for the removal. And I think that's backwards. And we really need to be looking at using all of our regulatory authorities to deal with it. So down the road, we don't have another PFAS, another group of chemicals that we have kind of the same issue. Hopefully we learn a lot from what we've been doing to address PFAS. Long-winded answer. Go ahead, Linda.
So a couple of things. FDA does regulate a few PFAS. In 2016, it regulated 7 of the legacy PFAS in food packaging. And I just read today somewhere that it is going to be regulating some of the short chain PFAS in food packaging as well. In 2020 or 21, it banned, or it reached a voluntary agreement with, believe it was 15 different food packaging companies not to use 6,2-fluoroethylamyl alcohol, because that can be metabolized to a branched chain PFOA. So we know that like E2 goes to PFOA, or to PFOS, depending what's hanging on the end of it. But the point is, FDA is doing that. It would sure be nice if it did a lot more, because there's lots of data showing that what's in food packaging can get into food. And in fact, there's new data showing that what's in food packaging, some of it over time even volatilizes, and then it gets into the air. You might potentially breathe it, but it will eventually end up in dust. We know that dust is a major sink, I would say, kind of for PFAS, and there's a lot there. So the Toxics Office of EPA is under the action plan that was started by Michael Reagan as the administrator for EPA, is looking at quite a number of different approaches, but so far the regulations it has done mainly are something called SNRs, which are significant new use rules. It has increased the requirement for notification about releases of PFAS from plants that are either producing or using it, but they are not, so far, are not doing extensive regulation on PFAS. I think FDA, the biggie in the government that can regulate PFAS, frankly, is the Department of Defense. And a major source of drinking water contamination has been the use of PFAS in air film forming foam. And as of the National Defense Authorization Act or Appropriation Act of 2020, by the end of 2023, the Department of Defense was not supposed to allow any PFAS in food packaging that they purchased or used. And by the end of 2024, they were not supposed to have any PFAS containing AFFF that they would use for the military. Now that's a tall order because there's been some difficulty meeting the military specifications for putting out fires in the time that it requires. But I can tell you that the major airports in Europe haven't been using PFAS containing AFFF for certainly 10 years or more, so maybe doable. But DoD has been a big user of PFAS, and regulating it by the Defense Department will have major implications going forward.
And I just wanted to add that I think one of the challenges with determining who gets a say in what products and processes contain PFAS has to do with an appropriate PFAS definition. I think when we put together our PFAS uses paper, which Julian Galuga was the lead author on that, we found that pharmaceutical uses of PFAS was one of the fastest growing areas of pharmaceutical development. So putting PFAS into pharmaceutical products. So that would fall under the FDA. We also found that there are uses of PFAS in pesticidal substances. And so some PFAS aren't defined as pesticidal substances, depending on whose definition that you use. So I think we need a definition that acknowledges PFAS across these multiple categories, and that would help to better define the regulatory authority for whether or not those particular uses of PFAS should be allowed. I think, or maybe not, are people aware that 5 member states in the European Union have put forward a PFAS restriction proposal to ECHA, the European Chemicals Agency? This restriction proposal would restrict all non-essential uses of PFAS in European Union member states. I think one of the challenges with that is who gets to determine what is an essential use of a PFAS versus a non-essential or easily substitutable use of a PFAS. So I think somebody here needs to come up with that definition, because if those who decide on whether or not PFAS are going to be used don't do it, those who make and use PFAS are going to do it. So somebody has to take that, I guess, sword in their hand. I don't know the right expression to use for that. But those are just a few thoughts from my perspective.
The essentiality concept has been used before under the Montreal Protocol for the definition of chlorinated hydrofluorocarbons. But Jamie's raising the issue of definition of PFAS is a major one, because different parts of EPA use different definitions. The Office of Research and Development has a definition that's very similar to the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, an international organization. I believe that about a year ago, OECD listed well over 10,000 different chemicals as PFAS. EPA's ORD lists on their dashboard has over 12,000 different PFAS. But the point that there are some pharmaceuticals which are PFAS as well as some pesticides is absolutely true. And a recent paper actually indicated that a significant amount of the unmonitored PFAS in water might turn out to be pharmaceuticals.
Which paper? I'm like, man, I have so much reading to do now.
I'll have to find it and
Yes.
get you the reference, but it was a recent paper that just came out. I'll find it.
Awesome, because I did just want to tack on, as I was hearing from Jamie, I just thought, you know, we're talking, and there's a lot that can be done and that should be done. EPA has so much that they're looking to accomplish. I think one of the things, because I saw in the chat earlier that someone mentioned the advanced notice of proposed rulemaking to add additional PFAS to CERCLA. I think it's also really important that we, you know, step back and also make sure all of our regulations impact other regulations. Like there's a lot of, so when we're looking at CERCLA, like Linda said earlier, okay, so if it's a hazardous substance, is that going to impact how we get rid of our effluent from ion exchange or the carbon from GAC? And so I think that's another thing too, is being, you know, how do we be proactive and responsive to the issue of PFAS while also not kind of backing ourselves into a corner with these kind of like overlapping regulations as we're going. It's trying to be very thoughtful and intentional with how we look to address these on, you know, it's hard enough for EPA when you have the Office of Toxics and the Office of Water trying to do the same things together, let alone when you're talking EPA, FDA, DOD, trying to work together on that. So it's a big lift, but I definitely think it's something that we need to be looking at.
I also just want to add that there have been individual companies that have had the foresight to remove PFAS from their products and processes. And there are organizations that have a listing of those companies who have committed to be PFAS free in their products and processes.
Great, that's really helpful. And I see requests in the chat that everybody wants all the papers. So what we will do from the Epicenter side is connect up with Linda and Jamie and Ryan and Stephanie, and we will collect all of these. We'll also go through the chat and the question and answer box, and we'll get all these resources put together, and they will go out to everyone who attended today. So you will get the slides, the resources, and the recording. So you will get a link to the recording. The recording will be posted directly on the same page you registered for, but who could find that in our email? So we will provide all of that to you in a follow-up email. It usually takes us a couple days to get the recording posted, but we will let you all know. So before everybody leaves, we do have a survey that we like. We ask people to fill it in to let us know if this was a helpful event for you, what more information you might need. I will remind you that Ryan wants to hear from all of you. So by May 30th, please submit your public comments and share what you've learned, what your concerns are. We know that this is a big lift for the EPA, and we're really thanking them for using science to inform this rule and going forward, continuing to use the science and information that's out there. I saw also in the Q&A a lot about treatment and destruction. And we at the Epicenter are tracking destruction technologies relatively closely. In the fall of 2022, we hosted a webinar about destruction technologies and kind of the state of these technologies. We're continuing to talk with folks and continue to learn more. And we will, you know, as things advance, we will certainly keep anybody who's attended this list. This is not the last, anyone who has attended this event, this is not the last time you will hear from us. So you will start getting some notifications as we do work, as we know that there are opportunities to contribute more. So again, I want to first thank all the panelists. You are incredible, very smart, wonderful people. So we really appreciate it. And then also thank all of the participants. The chat, I couldn't even follow, the Q&A, so many questions, and I hope that we address some of those. And let us know through that survey how we can do more to help you link up the science and the evolving science of PFAS and what's happening at the policy level. So with that, I will say thank you and get your comments in by May 30th.
Thanks so much, Rebecca and AAAS. This was great.
Thanks.
Thank you.